Brian's school trip. Brian was trying to be on his best behaviour, which wasn't easy, mainly because he didn't like being told what to do. This meant not tidying his toys away when he was asked to, not getting his pyjamas on, at least not until his mum got really cross, or not getting dressed and ready for school in the mornings, until there was a terrible rush, and he was always nearly late. The most popular one at the moment was not turning his Xbox off when he was asked, which generally resulted in him being told off and then stomping upstairs to his bedroom to sulk. Therefore, he was more frequently in trouble with either of his parents or his teachers at school. Brian was having his name moved in class, put on orange, which was a warning, and frequently red, which meant losing out on some playtime or even detention. Worse than detention, in Brian's opinion, was missing out on treats, like his favourite cola bottles. Brian loved cola bottles, not just for the yummy taste, but he'd like to see how far he could stretch it before he eats it. He found that if you sucked it and chewed it for a bit first, it softens it up. And then that way you could stretch it out even longer. Once, when watching Harry Potter on Netflix and holding a well-stretched, very sticky cola bottle, Brian suddenly dropped one end of the sweet and it flicked across the room and landed in his sister Daisy's school bag. He thought about getting it back, but she was always telling him not to touch her stuff. She was very bossy, so he left it in there. I dare say I'll hear about that when she finds it, he thought. The reason Brian was trying to be so good this week was because his class was going on a school trip to the zoo. Everyone had to be at school early on that Friday. They were going to the zoo on a double-decker bus. I'm going to sit upstairs right at the front, Brian told his friend Jacob. And I want to see the monkeys. I'm not bothered about all the other stuff. My sister Lily said that we are going to be put into groups, said Jacob. And we have to go wherever they say, and we all have to stay together, because it's a really big place and we could get lost. Brian said he'd hoped that we would be in the same group, because some of the other children moaned at him for being in trouble, or they laughed at him when he was showing off and he didn't get his own way. Brian hated it when people laughed at him. As luck would have it, they were in the same group, and Mrs. Brown's, Delilah's mum, was looking after that group. Now, children, it's most important that we all stay together. We are in the green group, and we will be wearing a green school badge with your name on it, said Mrs. Brown. The green group did sit upstairs on the bus, but at the back. Brian wasn't happy about that. But Jacob said sitting at the back could be fun. You could wave at other drivers and see who waves back. This started off fun for Brian, but soon got bored, and instead of waving, he started pulling funny faces and sticking out his tongue. This made the other kids laugh, but as usual, Brian was ready to take the joke a little bit too far. "Watch, Jake, I'm going to do a moonie," said Brian. For those who don't know, this involves dropping your trousers and showing off your bottom. "Are you crazy?" said Jake. "Put your seatbelt back on. You're going to get us in trouble. We're not even there yet." The other children laughed until the teacher told him off and told him to sit still and keep his noise down. "It's not fair," Brian moaned. The other kids were still laughing, and he sulked the rest of the journey on the bus. When they got to the zoo, the green group were going to see the elephants first, the monkeys and seals, lions, bears, and then a visit to the aquarium would be after lunch. Most of the class enjoyed seeing the elephants, and some of the children were chose by the keeper to feed them by hand. This annoyed Brian because he wasn't picked. "They stink anyway," said Brian. "Look at all that slobber on their hands. I don't want to do it anyway." Next were the monkeys, Brian's favourite. They were very noisy and jumping around and playing with a swing. This was made out of an old tractor tyre hanging on a big rope. The boys were leaping about and doing lots of monkey impersonations. After a while, Mrs. Brown said it was time to go and find the seals, and if they hurried, that they would be in time to see the zookeeper feed the seals fish. Brian would have rather stayed and watched the monkeys play, but seeing the keeper feed the seals sounded okay. Mrs. Brown's and the Green Group all managed to sit on the bench in the front row. The keeper came out holding a microphone so everyone could hear him introduce himself as Bob, and the two seals were called Daisy and Dash. "Yeah, they look like my big sister," said Brian, and they all laughed. Bob said that he'd been teaching Daisy and Dash some new tricks. When Bob blew the whistle once, both of the seals jumped out of the water and onto a small stage where Bob was standing there with a bucket of fish. Bob asked Daisy if you've been a good girl today, and Daisy nodded yes, and Bob threw her a fish. Bob asked Dash if he'd been good today. Dash lifted one fin to hide his face and shook his head no. "Oh dear," said Bob, "no fish for you then." Dash put out one fin to his face, looking very sorry for himself. Bob said, "Are you going to be good today?" And Dash nodded yes, so Bob threw him a fish. Bob gave 2 blows on his whistle, and both of the seals jumped back into the water with a huge splash, splashing everyone sitting in the front row, and Bob and the rest of the audience laughed. But Brian wasn't laughing. He didn't like getting wet, and he didn't like the smell of fish. "I don't see it being so funny," he yelled. Jacob said, "Don't be daft, Brian. It's not much. We'll soon dry in the sunshine." Brian whispered to Jacob, "Let's see if Bob thinks this is funny." He put his hand out in front of his face, pursed his lips, and gave one long whistle. Hearing the whistle, both of the seals jumped out of the water. Bob looked surprised. "Hey, you two, we've done that trick. Now back in the water you both go." Bob blew his whistle twice, and the seals jumped back in the water. Brian bent down and pretended to pull his sock up, and while bending over, gave another long whistle. Out jumped Daisy and Dash again. Everyone laughed at the surprised look that was on Bob's face. "What's going on here?" he said. "Back in you go." Brian thought this was so funny. This time he forgot to hide while whistling, and Bob spotted exactly what was going on. "Who was that? Who whistled at the seals to get them out of the water?" So this time Bob said, "Aha, we have a volunteer. Come on down to the stage, young man." Bob pointed to Brian. "Who, me?" said Brian. "Yes, you. Come and take a bow." "Oh, that's okay. I can do that," thought Brian. And Mrs. Brown, Green Group, and everyone else clapped as Brian made his way to the stage. When Brian got to the stage, Bob shook his hand and said, "I think I've seen you somewhere before. Have we met?" "No, I don't think so," said Brian. "Where are you from?" Bob asked. "I am from Willow School, and I'm in year 1, said Brian proudly. Did you by any chance come to the zoo by bus?" "Yes, we did," said Brian. "A double-decker bus." Bob moved the microphone to one side so that the audience could not hear the next question. "Were you sitting upstairs at the back of the bus?" Yes," said Brian, who suddenly had a funny feeling in his tummy. "I thought so," said Bob. "You were the young man pulling faces at me this morning and sticking your tongue out. I was the driver behind the bus." Brian went red and waited to be told off in front of everyone. So imagine his surprise when Bob said, "Well, at least you owned up and told me the truth. I like that. It's very important to tell the truth." Using the microphone, Bob told the audience that Brian was so good at whistling that he could help with the next trick. When told, Brian gave one long whistle and the seals joined Bob and Brian back on stage. They looked much bigger up close. They even smelt very fishy. Bob gave Brian a bouncy ball. "When I say now, throw the ball and Dash will come and catch it and balance it on his nose." "Now!" shouted Bob. Brian threw the ball, but not quite high enough. But clever Dash dipped his head, caught the ball and tossed it up in the air, and then balanced it on his nose. Everyone clapped and cheered. This time, Brian had to pass a toy trumpet to Daisy, and she manages to blow in it several times. Again, everyone clapped and cheered. Let's all say a big thank you to my young assistant, Brian. Dash held out one fin, and Brian was told to gently shake it. It felt all rubbery. The audience cheered. "And now, Daisy," said Bob. Brian walked over to Daisy and held out his hand, and she didn't move. "You need to get closer," said Bob. "No, closer than that." Brian moved much closer to Daisy, but she didn't move her fin. Instead, she bent her head and gave him a very wet, smelly, fishy kiss. "Yuck!" said Brian, as he fell on the floor in surprise, and he was wiping his face. The whole audience roared with laughter. The look on Brian's face said that he didn't like being laughed at. But before he could even think about showing off, Bob held the microphone against him and said, "Let's give another big cheer for my brave volunteer." And when he shook hands with Brian, he said, "Sometimes it's a very good thing if you can make everyone laugh, even if you're doing something really silly. When you go home, tell your family. Hopefully, they will laugh too." At the end of the afternoon, they made their way back to the bus to return to school. The green group were the last ones to arrive. The children climbed on board, chatting and laughing. Someone shouted, "Here comes Brian!" And they all started whistling and laughing. Just as Brian got to the top of the stairs, he tripped and stumbled, so everyone cheered again. He threw his bag down on the floor and was just about to throw a tantrum when Jacob said, "Brian, just take a bow." Brian stood up straight and bowed, and everyone clapped and cheered. Maybe it wasn't so bad being laughed at after all, if you could join in too. "Brian," said Jacob, "you're the hero of the day." The end.